For those of you who have just joined us, my name is Ryan Sheales. I'm the Communications Manager here at VCOSS, and I'd like to welcome you today. I'd also like to acknowledge that wherever you're joining us from today, we're meeting on the lands of Aboriginal people. I myself am on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people that might be joining us on the webinar here today. So this session is all about making sense of the Victorian budget. It's an event we normally run in April or May, because that's normally when the budget is, of course, and we're going to go through this. It's a year unlike any other in so many regards. And this event has sort of changed and tweaked along with that. So it's a bit different from what we've run in past years, not least of all the fact that we're doing it virtually. So I'll throw to David Hayward, Professor David Hayward, in just a moment. He's of course going to be running us through the lion's share of today's presentation. We have an hour marked out for this event. Most of that will be David himself. And I'll just bring this up here so you can see it. So essentially what David is going to run through is what to expect with the budget itself. So the budget papers, the budget as an exercise of government, and all that you can expect from that in general terms, but of course also in this COVID year. Then I'm going to return and we're going to go through a little bit of what you can expect on budget day, some of those more nitty-gritty mechanics of the day itself and how that actually plays out. I guess I'll just manage expectations a little bit in that regard, because we don't actually know a lot this year. Still, we don't know a lot about what the day itself is going to look like, but I'll run through what we do know and the things that VCOSS as the peak will be doing on the day, you know, even at this stage with the scant details that we do have. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce David Hayward, who'll be running us through today's main presentation. And you'll see there that we've got time factored in for questions of both David and myself. So David, take us away.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, and nice to have everybody here virtually. I'd like to begin also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and also acknowledge that the land was never ceded. Right, so today's session, look, I like to do these sessions by giving a particular theme, and I reckon the theme for this one, it's one to remember. You'll never forget it. As I'll be emphasising, it's very, very unlikely ever in your whole lifetimes you'll see anything like this again. It's unprecedented. It's actually really exciting. And I'm going to go through all of that. Why? I've got a couple of images or 3 images on the cover slide here to try and pick it up. Now, the first 2 should be pretty familiar to you. So the bottom one is lines of people, unemployed people queuing for food during the Depression. We've all seen images like that. Then there's images of the slums in Melbourne during the Great Depression. Similar sort of terrible imagery. And I put that up there because really we should have been seeing pretty similar images by now here in Victoria, because that's the nature of the times. We've gone through this really rapid economic contraction, strangely enough, without the social distress that was evident back in the 1930s. I'll touch on that a little bit presently. But I've also put up there a book that I contributed to way back in the late 80s called State of Siege. And I put that up there because there's a lot that's happening now that reminds me of what happened in the 80s. Back then there was a Kane Labor government that was the most reformist in the country. And it came to office remarkably on a platform of borrowing money for public spending, infrastructure works, middle of a recession. They wanted to pump prime the economy out of a recession. And where did they put the money? They put it into public housing. They did lots of things, and lots of things came out of that project, that State of Siege project. And I'll return to it later. I'm going to return to it at the end of this presentation because you know what? We're reaching a point now in the state where we're creeping back up to debt levels we haven't seen since the late 1980s. But you know what's different now is it's a very different narrative. And I want you to take that away with you. It's a very different political context than we've seen for the last 30 years. Very, very different context. So that's it, one to remember. And I'm going to cover a few things. Next slide, Ryan. This is basically what I'm going to cover. I've cover off this similar stuff each year, but I want to give you an introduction to the budget. What is it and how to analyze it? And it's kind of like nuts and bolts stuff. So look, you're going to go into the budget lockup. Well, we think there's going to be a budget lockup. Not sure how that's going to work just yet. But anyway, you're going to go in there and you're going to get a lot of information, and you've got to go through it in a very short period of time. And at the end of that couple of hours, you've got to have a press release ready. And it's a pretty daunting task because you've got so much to go through, and it's difficult to know where do you start, where do you finish, what do you ignore, what do you concentrate on. So I'm going to go through all of that. I'm going to talk about a theme for the budget, which is saving the state through a big build. No surprises there, we know, and the housing is crucial to that. I'm going to talk about, towards the end, Victorian Labor, and it's probably an appropriate point now to be thinking about the Andrews government's contribution to Victorian social policy. You know, and I reckon there's a case right now to be saying we're going from good to great here. I think this budget is going to be really, really good for Victorian social policy. What I'm not clear about, there's been so many announcements this year. I'm not sure how much is going to be really new in the budget, but I'll talk about that a bit later. But anyway, that's today. Next slide. Thanks, Ryan. So what is the budget? Well, I think just give it another click, Ryan. I think I might have just lost a heading there. Thank you. It's very, very impressive. The budget, what is it? Well, it's a core bit of the parliamentary system. And the essential idea is that when governments are spending money out of the bank account, and after all, it is our bank account, that they should get parliamentary approval. And the parliamentary approval comes from what's called appropriation bills, which authorise the government to spend from its bank account. So we're a democracy. Those appropriation bills have to be approved by the Parliament, the lower house in particular, in order for the government to spend. So that's technically what it's about, the appropriation bills. You'll probably never ever see those appropriation bills because there's the fancy documents that surround it called the budget papers, which have become a thing of modern politics. It's all about politics and in particular theatre. That budget has got to get a good press, right? It's the one day of the year, everybody looks at what the state's doing. Really important they get good press. The other thing to remember, it must make a difference. People are very cynical, right? So yeah, they might give it a mark of approval on the day, and this will get a mark of approval on the day, but what will ensure its success will not be what people think, it's what they feel, right? They think it's all right, but they feel lousy in a year's time, it ain't gonna work. So it's important it makes a difference. Next slide, Ryan. So you get all of these, you get 4 volumes, thousands of pages, spending, funding and financing. You've got massive numbers like, you know, and believe me, the government will hit you with numbers that are mind-boggling, you know, like even a figure like 5 billion on social housing. Well, how do you make sense of that? Is that a lot or is it a little? I'll talk all about that presently. But one thing I can do, don't go with what you were told, and whatever you do, don't read the media releases unless you really have to, and forget about budget paper number 1. I remember doing a video for Brian a couple of years ago where I just chucked budget paper 1 in the bin because that's just all the speech. It's the Treasurer's speech. It's still politics. You haven't got time to worry about on the day. Look at it later if you want to. Always go into a budget lockup thinking about the context. What is happening? You know, what's been happening? What sorts of things are around the budget? What's the social process behind things? What's the politics? What's the power? And in this case, next slide, right? Well, biggest economic contraction since the 1930s. That's obviously the big one in terms of the economics. And I've taken here a slide, a chart from the Treasury that was released back in July, showing gross state product, which is a measure of the size of the economy. And it shows, if you look at it on the left-hand axis, the value in millions of dollars. The economy's worth a lot. This is done by quarter. And you see that dotted line that goes upwards. That's what they expected was going to happen back at this time last year. And last December, that's when they last, I think, updated these projections. That's what they thought was going to happen. Now, the other 2 lines is what has actually happened. So one was the April estimate, which is the dark grey one, and then there's the blue estimate, which was revised in July. However you look at it, see that big gap between the dotted lines and the hard blue line? That is the recession come depression, whatever you want to call it. That fall of 15% in one quarter is like, that never happens. It's massive. But you can see that that gap, the output gap, is going to continue right through. That's permanently lost. That's a heck of a lot of money that's been lost. So very severe recession caused by, unusually, a virus, a pandemic, and government regulations, lockdowns to try and get on top of it. But the other thing that people forget about, it's not just government regulations, right? It's also people self-regulating. Like, who wants to go out if there's a chance you're going to get a virus that's going to kill you? Nobody does, which is the point that the free marketeers forget. Even if you had no regulations, people are going to self-regulate, but they're going to do it badly, and you're going to end up with the worst of both worlds. So the idea behind the lockdowns is really to enable things to get to a point where you can enable the economy to recover, which is sort of where we're at the moment. I put here kind of a bit cheekily, Victorian slapped twice with 2 lockdowns. Now that graph that I've got there, that chart 1, remember that was done in July before the second lockdown. So that the figures that come out in the budget on Monday are going to look quite a lot worse than that. So pretty terrible economic context. Just a couple of points to bear in mind, which in contrast to the 1930s, government's got it right this time. Most households were actually well supported. You know, we doubled unemployment benefits, introduced JobKeeper. These are massive programs worth, you know, 70 to 80 billion dollars, massive programs from the federal government that were pretty well targeted, and they were rolled out very quickly. What the state government did was to, you know, put cash support for those not on Centrelink or who were in marginalised job positions, services for homeless, took all the homeless people off the streets, gave them hotel rooms, closure of electronic gaming machines. Amazing response. It's almost as if the state government went, where are the gaps that the federal government's left? Let's plug them. Remarkable thing is that people couldn't spend, even if they had the money, because of the regulations keeping people at home. We're in a lockdown. What are you going to spend your money on? You know, so it's, but I think the point is about it that we went through this kind of depression, major recession, without all that pain of the 1930s. That is a great policy success, a really great policy success. Unfortunately, it is about to end. Next slide. Thanks, Ryan. These maps were taken from a report that I and some colleagues, Liz Ralston and Hayden Racemuth, did for VCOSS. It was published last week. The details are down at the bottom of the slide there. But we were looking at the impact of the federal government and state government interventions. The left map shows what poverty looked like back in April with no supplement, coronavirus supplement. All the dark red spots, lots of poverty. Darker red spots, really, really bad poverty. Middle map shows what happened once the supplement was introduced. So the dole was doubled and poverty basically disappeared for Centrelink recipients. What you see October, the October map, the last map, is how it's returning because that supplement has been reduced significantly, and it's all due to end next March. So the picture will go back to where we were, unfortunately. But for the time being, and certainly back in those really critical months of the year, a lot of support. Next slide. Thank you, Ryan. The politics. Well, happy days are here again, in a sense. This is a budget that's designed to give stimulus to the economy. Just as the federal government stimulus ends, this is meant to kick in. Debt is suddenly good. Now, that is such a massive change. You know, like, that hasn't happened in my lifetime of debt being seen good. It was always seen to be bad. Big spending is good. Haven't seen that either. You know, the New South Wales government, as I speak now, is going to introduce a scheme like the British had of paying people to go out for dinner. $500 million with 4 vouchers for every individual person in New South Wales to go out to get a bite to eat or to go to the theatre, whatever they want to do. Can't spend on alcohol, they can't spend it on gambling. But that's just unheard of. The federal government's given people on Centrelink payments $750, and then there's 2 more $250 payments. They can spend it on whatever they want. These are just unbelievable times, really. The good times, this is what the politics of this budget will be. The happy days are here again. That's what it's meant to. So this budget is meant to kind of awe us for the initiatives, because they're meant to really pull Victoria right out of that recessionary mix. Next slide. Thanks, Ryan. Little bit of the luck of the Irish. Tim Pallas had spent up big in his last couple of budgets and was really constrained by the rules he put in place around the budget. And it was a bit tricky to see how he was going to do things without breaking those budget rules that he himself developed. Well, then what happened? The Reserve Bank governor piped up back in just very recently, and just back in August, and said that he wanted the states to forget all their existing rules, spend up big. Whatever you want, spend up big, and he will help pay if necessary by buying state government bonds. How lucky is that? I mean, that's fantastic. Really good coordination between federal and state agencies, I might add. So where do you look when you're in that budget lockup? It's go to the budget paper number 2, budget strategy and outlook. It's a really, really important one. It's just the strategic document, terrific overview, lots of data, putting everything in context. And so, you know, if you're sitting there and you think, what did David say? He said, what do? You go to budget paper number 2. So what did David say? What do? You go to budget paper number 2, strategy and outlook. You can have a look at spending trends. What's happening? There are a lot of new initiatives, output initiatives, capital initiatives, after efficiencies. Remember, have a look per year, not in total, right? So when the state government says 5-point-something billion for social housing, it's $1 billion a year, and that's a bit of a different picture than 5 billion in total. Still amounts insane, but it's a very important thing to keep in mind. What's happening to inflation and population growth? Are we talking about increases that are faster than inflation and population growth or not? And look at payments as a whole. Don't just take the new initiatives, because there may be cuts everywhere. You're not going to see a lot of that this time. This is going to be a very generous budget by all standards. But you also might want to think, well, how durable are these spending initiatives? And a lot of them won't be durable in that they're designed to fix a recession, but they stop, okay? They're going to stop. So just have a look at that. Are we talking about durable initiatives? Remember, I just mentioned a lot of the things that have been done to date this year, they're designed to end, they're not ongoing. And that's an important caveat. Just to give you an idea of how bad things have, of how much things, I should say bad, how much things have slipped from December last year, when the state government did its budget update. They were expecting a budget surplus of about 600 million, right? It was a little bit down on what they expected when they released the budget, when it was meant to be about $1 billion. I'm looking at the table here, the top line, and they were thinking in this 2021 there'd be a budget surplus of about 1.453 billion. The budget update in December, 1.2 billion, so it came down a little bit. Revised down to a deficit of 7.5 billion and about 11 billion. That's a massive slippage. And a slippage of around about, from the update, about 8 billion for last financial year and 12 billion this. Same thing, excuse me, with government debt, which is well and truly on its way up very rapidly, but I'll come back to that. Next slide, thanks, Ryan. By the way, this shift in government finances is not peculiar to Australia, to Victoria or Australia. Actually, we do have one state government that it is peculiar to, that's Western Australia, whole other story. I've put in here a graph that's taken from the US Congressional Budget Office, which just shows US federal government debt, deficits, I should say. So not the debt, but the deficit as a percentage of GDP going back to 1970, projected through to 2030. And you'll see that that deficit kind of hovered around the -2% of GDP sort of thing, going down during when there was recessions and improving when there was boom. So that surpluses during the 90s, that was Bill Clinton's time in office and the economy boomed. But have a look at what's happened. GFC, it slips massively in deficit, -10%. Trump comes to office, and then the coronavirus and the recession, that's an unbelievable deficit, 16% of GSP. That's huge. And that was on the back of Trump's tax cuts. I put in there a picture of a professor of economics at the University of Newcastle, Bill Mitchell. Bill Mitchell has been pushing an argument for some time around, it's now become known as modern monetary theory, that we shouldn't worry about deficits. In fact, deficits are a really good thing if there's unemployment. So he's a sort of a celebrated economist worldwide who doesn't get very much coverage here, but he's had a tremendous influence in economists rethinking the role of deficits and debts when unemployment is high. Bill argues, don't worry about a deficit because the Reserve Bank can just simply buy the government bonds. What you've got to do, concentrate on getting unemployment as low as possible. That's the key thing. As long as unemployment is high, it's entirely appropriate to be borrowing money and to be running deficits. So that's the context. Next slide, thanks, Ryan. So budget paper 2, great for overall details, gives you estimates of economic growth, inflation, employment growth, population growth. The population growth is going to be shocking. Keep your eye on that one because we haven't ever seen that before. Population growth this year is going to be so low. It'll be the lowest level, well, I think since the 1930s. And that's going to have a really, really big impact in itself. Budget paper 3, another really important budget paper to look at, service delivery. The great thing about budget paper number 3 is that you can get detailed data by department, including new initiatives and the less useful output statements by program. You know, those stupid output measures that they have, most of them don't mean much. But what you do get is that you can see what the initiatives are by department. So somebody's interested in housing. I don't know if they've split Homes Victoria out of DHHS. I don't think they have. You'll find it in the DHHS department's statements, but you'll see all the money in there over the next 4 years. It's fantastic. It's really good. And you can just go down the list and say, wow, look at all the things that have been announced. And you can work out whether and how it relates to you or not. The other thing to bear in mind, as long as there is a budget lockup, the Treasury officials are tremendously helpful if you've got questions on anything in the budget papers. They're really, really helpful. Budget paper number 4, also very useful, this time for capital programs. That public housing, by the way, will probably come out, most of it will come out in the capital program, again broken down by department. But there are a number of initiatives for social housing which will come up as output initiatives. So there's industry development money, I think it's 6 million and various things like that. So depending upon what area you're interested in health, mental health, whatever, you can get the detailed breakdown, really, really useful. Budget paper number 5, statement of finances, another really good one to look at, and I encourage you to do it. I don't think you'll see any tax increases in this budget. You're going to see tax decreases just because of the state. When the economy collapses like this, just think about it, all those people out of employment, what happens to payroll tax? The property market went from weekly sales of around about 700 or 800 back at the beginning of the year. Around August, you were looking at about 30, right? Think about that, 700 or 800 property sales to 30. I mean, that's smashed stamp duties. And the other thing that's happened is that Commonwealth grants, by virtue of the GST revenues, they've collapsed. And Victoria's really smashed them in a way because of the second lockdown. Affects all of the states and territories because the pool of money that's raised from the GST goes towards this big bucket that's then distributed to all the states and territories based on a complex formula. Our revenues are going to be down massively without any question about it. Good to have a look at this, just to check, just to see what's going on. Some of the other things, the other good things, I reckon, gambling tax is going to be smashed again because they closed the poker machines. But for next year, you're going to start seeing them come back again. That's a bad thing because we know that those EGM taxes in particular come disproportionately from pension and benefit recipients. Next slide, thanks, Ryan. Just some tricks to watch for. Self-publicity. They'll use, because it's going to be a big spending budget, they'll use a lot of phrases like the biggest ever. It may be, but it may not be. You've always got to go back in time. I remember I said to you, 82, 83 was pretty big for the state for public housing. I actually think this is going to trump it, but just be careful about those statements. You've always got to go back in time. We actually used to spend with the Commonwealth a lot on public housing back in the 50s and the 60s. It's just that we sold the stock off, but there was a lot of building, but it was done with the Commonwealth and the state working together under the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement. The difference this time that makes it eye-catching, it's all state money, no Commonwealth money. It's a really, really impressive thing that they're proposing to do. And just be wary of those statements. Need to adjust for, as I said, population growth and inflation. Projected inflation, good idea to see what's happening with the economy. If the economy is projected to grow by 3 or 4 or 5%, if the growth in health spending is 3, 4 or 5%, maybe that's not so good. Also, one of the things that governments do is that they will add up 4 or 5 years of spending into one big sum. Just be careful about that. So call that summer over the rainbow, because you know what can also happen in 2 years' time? They might change their mind, or they might go, okay, we'll keep that in place, but we're going to cut some other program area to make up for it. And various other things like sandbagging, making things look worse to keep a lid on spending. That's not going to happen this time. Magic puddings, I've referred to this before. Privatizations are always sort of presented as a magic pudding. They ain't a magic pudding. If you sell something off that's income producing, you lose that income. You might get a big stack of money up front, but you've got to look at what's the income stream that's been forgiven. What John Quiggin has shown, our great economist up in Queensland, is that mainly our privatizations might have netted a one-off sum of money, but they've lost an income stream that was worth more. Next slide, thanks, Ryan. Big theme, the key theme, this is saving the state. It's going to be presented as the state being saved. We've done the hard work of the second lockdown. Why aren't we great? You deserve a big spend. This big housing build is going to be very popular. I think most Australians see this as being a necessary. It's another example, I think, of the state government having a great political ear for the right thing to do. This social housing spend, I'm sure, is going to be popular. We know they're going to be building the suburban rail loops, the first tranche of it, 2.2 billion. I don't think that's going to start until the next financial year. So bear that in mind, have a look at when it starts. It's about 900 million for mental health. And then there's all those COVID-19 promises made this year where the money's already rolled out. And I've just taken this bottom slide, the graph from the Parliamentary Budget Office, which conveniently lists all of the promises and costs them where possible. Not all of them are costed, but so far the total comes to about 12.3 billion. To put that into some sort of context, I'm really happy if net new initiatives come to about $1 billion. So, wow, that's incredible. Look at that. In education, 2.4 billion, health, 2.2 billion, tech, transport, 700. Anyway, the figures are mind-bogglingly big right across, and that's just in this period from March until now that's already been announced. So I said, I'm just not sure with the budget papers how much is going to be of the new initiatives are going to include what's already announced as against new announcements. Normally, I'd be really cynical about that, but you know what? The spend is so big and so sustained, I honestly wouldn't quibble. I think we should be celebrating what the government has done, and just lock in your mind those images of those people back in the Great Depression of how they were left by governments who are keen to balance their books by cutting spending. Think about what's happening this time. It really is to be celebrated. It's a tremendous effort. Next slide. Thank you, Ryan. Well, that brings me to this issue that I mentioned at the beginning. And I sort of been thinking about this a little bit over the last couple of years, because the government's contribution to net new output initiatives, so that's like new programs in homelessness, you know, right across the social policy spectrum, that's my sort of litmus test of how generous a government is being. And you can see I've gone back to, in this graph, I've gone back to May 2002, and the figure on the left-hand side is the in millions. And you can see that during the Brax era, you know, they crept up from pretty first, you know, 200 million up to 800 odd million, then slid down the dark years of the coalition when the budget was in trouble, and they cut back to almost zip net new initiatives in 2014. But look under the Andrews government, you see how they've just climbed up until not last budget, but the one before that was a record spend, like massive. This is in real term, I've adjusted for inflation. And you can see even last year was still right up there. Now, I wasn't expecting last year to be as generous as it was, but it was that generous. All the programs on free TAFE, all the work, all the money they put into family violence. There are lots and lots and lots of things that they've done. And I reckon we're gonna have to live a long time before we see it. Now, this, by the way, for this year, this budget, that's going to go through the roof again because of what they've done. It's a long time since we've seen that, and credit for where credit's due. You know, They benefited during the good times when the stamp duty taxes were flowing in, but they put it back into policy initiatives. Not all of it went to our causes, and a lot of it went on. They also had their own big construction boom, which has probably been more helpful to businesses rather than anybody else. But still, this is a very progressive government, and behind that big spend are all sorts of other initiatives like assisted dying, the treaty, the family. But there's a long list of really impressive social reforms. When I look around the world right now, I mean, if anybody knows any government, regional government or national government that's got a better track record than the Andrews government right now, I'd really like to hear about it. Next slide. Thank you, Ryan. All right, so that's brings me to my concluding thoughts, and I just want to sort of cover off on the things that I've touched on so far. Look, these are amazingly unusual times. I remember as an undergraduate student when I was studying economics and reading about the Depression, thinking, I wonder what it would have been like to live through there, because you had 30% unemployment. For people who stayed in work, it wasn't so bad because you had deflation, but for the 30% who were unemployed, it was horrendous because all of the systems of social support in income, health, house, a lot, that nothing was there. It was horrendous. Well, you know what, we've just seen almost what it would have been like, but we never got to see it because of government intervention. We can be really proud of what federal and state governments have done. If you're looking for something to read over the next couple of weeks, do read Catherine Murphy's book, The End of Certainty, the little quarterly essay, which is a terrific analysis. She's interviewed Scott Morrison and other major figures to get a sense of what were they thinking? Why did a conservative government do what you wouldn't expect them to do? Just have a read of it and just reflect on it, because it's a very unusual time, much more consistent with the Labor government to be doing the sorts of things that happen, but it's unprecedented. This budget will be generous, no doubt about that, which they've already been told, be generous. That's what the governor of the Reserve Bank has told Tim Pallas, be generous, and he will be generous, and it will be good for Victorian social policy. This is going to be a really good day for the sector. There's going to be a lot of stuff in there. It's either already been announced or it's new, and it's going to be exciting. There's lots of great, and how could you not be mightily proud of this stuff that's happening with social housing? It truly is awesome, I think. There is a bit of a sting. It's going to be in the out years. One of the things to think about, there's an interesting graph in the federal budget papers where they've got the projected expense and revenues from for this decade, basically right out to 2030. And what you see is that expenses, after hitting a record level, slide back to a level below they were last year by the end of the decade. Now that means that they're plugging in not only a lot of the programs disappearing that they put in place, but they must have in mind other programs that will also cease to operate. That's scary, because just think about that. That means all this generosity we've just seen might be made up with more cuts to the very same people who just benefited now. Just it's going to happen a few years down the road, so they pay for what's happened this year. I do hope that doesn't happen in the Victorian case. So just have a look, be careful, because this thing will be in the out years when they're going to have to try and get the budget back into some sort of shape. But you know what? I'd worry about that next year. I don't think I'd be too concerned about it this one. This is a time to be thinking about the initiatives that are in place, get cracking, and just think historically we haven't seen anything like this. And my last slide, Ryan, which is this. And you remember that I began by talking about that book, State of Siege, written in the 1980s, with a whole lot of economists all around the country looking at the state governments and the situation they were in. And I mentioned Bill Mitchell as one of the economists who helped work on that. This is the graph that is quite a nice reminder of that period. And this takes net debt for the budget sector for Victoria as a percentage of GSP. That's a way of measuring the government spending, percentage of gross state product, percent of the size of the economy. And you can see back to 87, it was about 12%. We hit that recession, and then by 93, it had hit 16%. Kenneth came in, debt crisis, must sell everything, get rid of debt, blah, blah, blah. But really from that period, from 1991, the guilty party era, right through until now, debt has been bad. Now, what you can see there is that under the Andrews government, and particularly during this coronavirus recession, see how the debt is creeping back up. Now, I think it's going to hit, it's going to go over what the Kane-Kerner government left it, that's for sure. What's fascinating this time is it's not going to come with a guilty party tag, right? Everybody's going, you go right ahead, this is a good thing. So it's sort of as a bookend of a 40 years of major reform. We're in the middle of this ideological shift that's suddenly being favourable towards big government, big spending, aggressive government. And I think Victorian social policy and Victorians generally will be a beneficiary. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take whatever questions you have.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. And yes, we'll jump straight into the questions. We've got another 20 or so minutes before our allocated time ends, so we'll get straight into it. Just a note on that, so you can submit your question through the Zoom webinar area. Just look for the little Q&A icon. I've got a few that also came through before the event, so we might start with those. David, someone's asking about old and new funding. You know, often you get a funding announcement on budget day, but a lot of it's actually old pre-announced funding. How do you disseminate that? How do you work out what's old and what's new?
I don't know how they're going to do it this time, Ryan. That was a great question, whoever asked it, because remember, we have got a bucket load of things that have just been announced. We've never had that before a budget so much announced. They've got a Treasurer's advance way back in April, which is basically like a loan for the Treasurer to spend. I think it was $12.5 billion or something like that without any further parliamentary approval. That's all got to end up being accounted for somewhere. So there's going to be a lot of old and new money in the budget papers. I think what you'll need to do is just go into the lockup with a list of things that have already been announced, so that when you go through the list of initiatives, you can go, no, that's already done, that's already done. But you remember also you can ask the Treasury people, and they'll clarify that.
And just on that, would you recommend people actually go back to last year's or previous year's actual budget papers, or what's the best way to get your head around those pre-existing commitments?
It will be that Parliamentary Budget Office. Go there because they've got a list of everything that's been committed to date. It's pretty impressive. Like, it's a really long list of things by area and by date. So go there. It's just Google Victorian Parliamentary Budget Office. It's pretty easy to use, all that information, but that's what I do. Great.
We'll make sure we include that link in the follow-up email to this event then as well. Powering through, we've got a question from Catherine from Yakvik. She asks, with reference to the federal budget, they had a number of big sounding spending that was really reliant on private sector investment, hiring credits, affordable housing, so on and so such. Do you think the state government will have any of the same kind of thing?
They could do. So you'll have to look at the detail of what's being proposed. It really depends. Yeah, I'm sure there will be somewhere in there things like that, but what they might be, I don't know. But yeah, it is worth having a look at that.
Yeah, we've had a specific question which I know you touched on in one of your last slides, but a specific question about debt. And that is that with interest rates so low, isn't it a good time for governments to be borrowing money? And should we be concerned by the large government debt moving forward?
No, there's no need to be concerned. In fact, that graph that I put up is rather a cheeky one, because I could have taken it all the way back to 1960 or something like that. Back in 1960, it was sitting, the state's debt as a whole was sitting at about, if I remember correctly, about 60% of the size of the economy. So no, there's no need to worry. And if you have a look around the world, you'll see that other countries' debts are far worse than ours. The one caveat I'd have on it, and which is why, I do think it's important that the debt's not really so much a problem. It's what's the money being spent on. That's what you've got to think on. There's a cost, but there's a benefit. I don't like things like that Eat Out to Help Out scheme that they're going to announce in New South Wales. The UK government did it. I think that's, quite frankly, a scandalous use of government money, taxpayers' money. But I don't know why. I just don't understand why you would do that. So I always think it's not so much that is debt funded, it's what's it being used for. That's the critical question.
Fantastic. And we've got a question here, I think that goes to a question of language and jargon, perhaps. You made a couple of references to output measures, specifically in budget paper number 3. Can you just expand on what you mean by that? That's literally the dollar figure of what we're spending, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Look, it's a really good point. So basically, it's the new announcement. So the output measure, new output initiatives could be new homelessness services, could be increased support for education and training, could be new vocational education places, whatever it is. So it'll be described, and then there'll be a sum of money against it. And that's how you can see if the money's there, because if it's not funded, it's of no real consequence to us, is it? So, but that's where you'll see how much has been allocated towards it. Now, what I was saying to you also is that even though it's important to look at that, don't take it as face value. Do sort of cross-check and make sure it's not coming at the expense of some other program that's being defunded or something like that. How do you know? Well, there is a line in the budget papers that will show the savings that are helping to fund the new initiatives. I don't think that there'll be a huge amount this year. I don't think Tim Pallas is interested in savings this time. Sometimes it can be substantial. I don't think that it will be, but just be a bit cautious on that.
Fantastic. And just a question on that as well. Someone asked, given the weird timing of the budget, 6 or so months later than when we normally have it, how will that be represented in the budget papers? Will it be split, or how would you imagine that is presented?
No, it'll be, I think they'll just do it like a normal, funnily enough, it's a really good question, but I was talking about the 1980s. Well, it was right up until, just trying to think, the end of the 90s, I think, or the mid 90s. The budget used to be brought down in September. So we're sort of not that far away from where we used to be. That's what they used to do, is that the budget would be brought down about a quarter into the financial year for which it was being brought down. So I think this will be just a one-off. They'll play catch up. There's a lot of things that haven't had parliamentary scrutiny, and I've been surprised, quite frankly, at the lack of scrutiny so far, and the government has really gotten away with it. I think on crisis, it's got to get on with things, but hey, we are at a democracy, and it should have proper lower house scrutiny. So it'll all be squared up in this budget, but it'll be an unusual one, and I think we'll go back to the normal cycle next year. I don't like the budget being brought down in May, by the way, because I think it's too long before the start of the financial year. Too many things can change. I would prefer that it was brought down a bit closer towards when the financial year begins.
Fantastic. Just a reminder to keep those questions coming in through the Zoom webinar function, and I'll keep asking them here of David. We had one about funding on accessible transport specifically. I'm not sure whether you're going to be able to field that one, but I might get you to answer it in this context, because we have had other questions about where do I find my thing? If I have a specific funding element or, area that I want to see, the nuts and bolts of it, how do I go about finding my little thing?
Your little thing, you'll get it from two ways. Remember I mentioned don't worry about the media releases. Well, sometimes they can be quite handy, because they do media releases by department, and they highlight each area, as you can imagine. I prefer not to do that. If it's me, I prefer to go to the budget paper. So that budget paper number 3 will list all of the output initiatives. I'm sorry about the jargon, but the new program, something like accessibility for public transport, that will be listed as an output initiative in the Department of Transport. You'll see it listed there or not. If it's not listed, it hasn't been funded.
All right then. And the biggest ever, again, I know you did refer to this, but it doesn't always take into account population growth. With the way everything's changing at the moment, this year in particular, is that likely to be the case again this year, that we'll have to really account for population growth in that same way?
No, but there won't be population growth. That's what's so bizarre. It's the population projections haven't been updated yet at the state level, but all those planning projections, all those ideas about, more road infrastructure, it's all changed. We don't know when we're going to go back to being able to have migration levels where we are, but for the moment, there's a great big question mark. Now, the significance of this point is this: for the last probably 20 years, Victoria has depended heavily for its economic growth on population growth. Well, if we haven't got any population growth, where is it going to come from? Think about this also. The universities, right? Universities were teaching a lot of international students. You look at RMIT around my university, around the city, it's unbelievable. When the international students are there, it's phenomenal. Well, you go there now and it's like a ghost town. Sydney University has just announced that their enrolments are only down 4%. What they've done, they've shifted their international load to online learning. Maybe those international students won't be coming back. What about that impact? That's going to have if that happens, that's going to have enormous knock-on effect. So that demographic question, whoever asked that, that's a great question. Keep your eye on that because it hasn't been spoken about yet, but it's, potentially it's the biggest thing to be worried about, the biggest risk to the state.
David, I might just pause here for a moment to make a brief little observation about the lockup, because we've got a few questions about the lockup itself. And you can see I've got that holder slide there saying, what will the budget day look like? Not this. The truth of the matter is at the moment, even though we're only a week or so out from budget day, we still don't have a clear indication of what the practicalities of budget day will be. So traditionally, and you can see in the image there and from what David's been referring to, organisations such as ours send a representative or, two if you're lucky, into a lockup, which is, physically everyone's put in the same room, the doors are locked, your phones are confiscated, and you're given a couple of hours to go through the budget papers and analyse them and get your head around them. And in that environment, you have the ability, as David's referenced, to actually call across, government staffers and Treasury officials and say, what does this mean and what does that mean? It's highly, highly, highly unlikely we're not going to be in a physical space next week. Exactly where we'll be and how we'll do it, we don't know. The government hasn't given us that indication. If you look to the federal budget for some guidance, that was done entirely remotely for stakeholders. With sent copies of files and, verification codes and all different security protocols. It may be that, it may be different, but either way, we're going to be, I would imagine, remote and looking through them as soft copy documents, digital files, as opposed to having the full physical book to actually go through. So that's my prediction, but hopefully we'll get some guidance, some firm guidance from the government, very soon. I'm sure their minds are on this. And just a little note on what that means for VCOSS, because obviously normally on the day, we're very active and present in the lockup, but also in and around Parliament doing a lot of our analysis and media response. Because we don't know where we're going to be, we don't quite know what that looks like yet. But I just thought I'd make the general point that whatever that looks like and the lockup looks like, we as VCOSS are going to be very active on the day, getting ourselves and the policy team is going to be working hard in their portfolio areas to get across the detail of what's been announced, what's in the budget, what's not in the budget, what's potentially missing in action. And we'll be publishing that on our website throughout the course of, I imagine, the afternoon, if all the timings are the same in past years. But either way, over the course of that day and the subsequent days, we'll be putting a lot of this detail on our website and updating it as new information comes to hand. Now, I just want to mention that for two reasons. One, because it's a good way for you to find out the information. You don't have to do this alone. David's giving you a lot of tools today, and that's great. But we obviously are there to help you and to support you in that as well. So we'll be giving you a lot of information from what we can decipher. But it's also a key role of VCOSS to amplify your voice and your views, and that of our members. So I just give as my role in communications, if you have a particular view on something, if you've found something particularly, excellent or disappointing, if you've done that media interview or put out that media release or whatever it is, let us know and we'll include that in our analysis as well and be able to push that out to our wider audience. So I just wanted to make those couple of points. And while I've been doing so, a couple of questions have come in, so that's great. And I'll just answer one myself because it says, this is probably a silly question, it's not, but what time is it generally released? So generally in a non-COVID year, the budget lockup will start sort of in the morning, like 9, 10 a.m. And it generally gets released around 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the Treasurer takes to his feet in Parliament to deliver the budget speech. So yeah, anyone's guess whether that's the same timing this year, but that's definitely what's happened in past years. I'll throw one at you, David, and see if you can answer this one. You might not be able to. What kind of initiatives will be the big winners in the $880 million that has already been announced for mental health spending? Now, you're still on mute there, David.
Sorry, the initiatives are all going to be to pick up the recommendations of the Royal Commission. So I'm not sure what those recommendations are, but they'll all be to address those.
All right, fantastic. Now, we in the sector are always interested, I'm just reading here, in indexation levels for particular bits of funding. Is that something that's listed in the budget papers themselves? And where would you find it, I guess?
Well, look, the key one will be their estimate of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, because everything tends to go a little bit around that. But again, inflation is running at near zero at the moment. So, yep, it's, but you'll see their estimate of wages growth, you'll see their estimate of consumer price inflation. So yeah, those indexes are there. Not all of the indexes that are tied to funding agreements, they're not all published, but you'll get a sense from trends in CPI.
Okay. And what about, someone's made reference here to Commonwealth payments, you know, things like partnership agreements. We know we live in a federation, it makes it messy sometimes. How do you find that information? Yeah,
that's listed in there. That's there's a chapter in budget paper number 2, and there's also the Commonwealth payments are broken down in more detail. Remember I mentioned that budget paper on revenue? That has not just state taxes and charges, but also all the Commonwealth payments are all listed in there too.
Fantastic. And you went through a number of the sort of tricks and traps. With the sandbagging one, that's not one I'm imagining you'd expect this year?
No, I don't think so. This is as I keep emphasising, this is a really unusual budget. So I don't expect to see very many tricks like that. I just don't think so. I think the emphasis going to be around the big spend and the importance of the spend to get Victoria going again. And it's just a really unusual time, Ryan. And I honestly can't think of another time where a budget set up to spend is going to be so well received. It's like everybody goes, yep, just makes absolute sense. It's somebody's pointed out already, got near zero interest rates, right? So, well, if you can get money for zip, well, why not spend it? You know, it's a most unusual time period, but I think also coming on the back of the second lockdown, and Victorians and Melburnians in particular doing such a magnificent job, it kind of sets it up for this sort of budget, I think. Bear in mind though that let's see what happens in 2 or 3 years' time when they've got to start trying to amend the budget, how they'll go about doing it.
And actually, that was going to be my next question, because you've mentioned, you know, we're probably going to see a lot of cash this year, and then it's the future years we have to worry about. I guess it's more a question of strategy. Is there anything we should be doing this year, knowing that there is going to be a sting in the tail in subsequent years, to manage that and manage the expectations of that money actually eventuating in future years?
Look, the big worry for me is the GST, because as long as there are not just regulations, but people have in their own mind, no, I won't go out today because I'm worried about the coronavirus. People are not going to spend. I know online spending has picked up, but it hasn't made up for the decline in physical spending. If that happens, GST payments to the states will not be so good. And remember, that was put in there as a growth revenue. If it's not a growth revenue, the states are all in trouble. Well, what's the thing? What would the Commonwealth probably look at doing? Maybe they'd look at increasing the GST. I don't think I'd want that. If they don't do that, the states are all going to be in trouble around service delivery. So I think we're about to see a pretty tough kind of discussion at that level. You know, what's going to make up for this gap with if this GST, because it makes up about half of Victoria's revenue. It's huge. So that's, if I was VCOSS, I'd be very conscious of the revenue side of the budget. What we don't want to see EGM, you know, this would have been a great time to just get out of the EGM business altogether and find another tax or a charge. I think your question is a really good one. The more I think about it, Ryan, the more I think it would be great for the sector to put its mind around the revenue equation, because we tend to think on the spending side of it. But if the revenue is coming from somewhere like, I hate to keep saying it, but EGMs, that's no good at all. That's a terrible way of raising money for a public program, however good the program might be. So putting our mind and putting some pressure on the state government for itself to think about a longer term revenue strategy, it might be a good thing to go on the front foot around that very issue.
All right then, and I might just note as we close out today's proceedings, the budget will be delivered on the Tuesday. On the Thursday morning, we've secured the Treasurer himself, Tim Pellis, for a morning event with the sector and with VCOSS members. So I'll make sure the details for that event are in the follow-up email to this briefing. But essentially, we'll be running an event on Thursday morning. It'll be digital. You'll be able to stream it from your couch. Hosted by Raphael Epstein from ABC Radio. Tim Pellis will be our key guest, and also Danielle Wood from the Grattan Institute, picking over the details of this most unprecedented of state budgets. So I'll send out the details for that. Thank you, David, for all of your expertise and knowledge today. And thank you to all of you at home for tuning in and participating. If there's anything we've missed, anything you'd like us to follow up and answer, please send it to us in an email and we'll do our best to get that information back to you. Thank you very much for joining us.